because I'm about to introduce the biggest superstar in the legal profession. He's a law professor with millions and millions of followers on social media. He's Professor Khaled Beydoun, law professor, author, and scholar extraordinaire. Professor, thank you for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. I'm sure, for the first time. I see you're a very youthful professor. Once upon a time in my life, professors looked older than me. You look like you could be my son, but that in no way detracts from your eminence as a scholar. Very glad to meet you. Before we go on to the area of your ethnic origin, I'd like to talk to you about America first, if you'll allow me. I've been predicting for many months now, 12 months, that Kamala Harris cannot possibly win the state of Michigan, because I happen to know the state of Michigan, and in particular Dearborn, very, very well. I always joke, it's the only place in the whole world I've ever met police officers who took selfies with me and whose cars were adorned with pictures of Syed Hassan Nasrallah, American cops in Michigan. It's a very Arab, a very Muslim area. Kamala Harris cannot surely win Michigan while slaughtering Arabs in Lebanon and in Palestine. And no Democrat has ever won the presidency whilst losing Michigan. Have I got that right, do you think?
Well, first of all, it's an honor and a privilege to be talking with you today, George. And I'm actually speaking to you from Dearborn, Michigan, right in the heart of Dearborn, Michigan, where you're exactly right. We have a massive Arab and Muslim American population. And your analysis is correct. Yeah, Michigan is not only a swing state, but historically, it's one of a handful of states that can predict where the election is going to go. I'll say this: I wish that I wish that I shared the certitude that you have with regard to how this election is going to go. These last several weeks, I've been traveling the country, and let me tell you, I think that more than any other election in recent time, this coming election perplexes me more in terms of where it's going. But my position is one and the same as yours, and I've said so publicly that, you know, anybody that can endorse or support a candidate who is directly connected to genocide needs to get their ethical clock inspected immediately.
Yeah, don't worry about that, Professor. Most people wish they had my certitude, not just about that, but about everything. Your more balanced legal opinion is what I'm seeking here. It seems to me that the tide has turned, and not just on the wars in the Middle East. It's turned on the issue of freedom of speech, for example. The so-called left, liberal, so-called progressives want to shut down freedom of speech and have effectively shut it down. They lament, for example, that the old order in Twitter is no more, even though we now know that the old order in Twitter was hand in glove with the Democratic Party in suppressing not just opinion, but truthful facts, like the contents of Hunter Biden's laptop, for example, now universally acknowledged to have been true, then falsely and near universally claimed to have been Russian disinformation. The issue of the danger of war in Ukraine spilling into a US-Russia nuclear superpower confrontation. These are surely both big issues that would persuade people not to put the Democrats back in again.
Yeah, you know, I think the pendulum has definitely shifted with regard to where authoritarianism is going, right? I mean, I think, you know, 8 to 10 years ago, there was mass concern around the rise of Trumpism and, Donald Trump, embodying this new sort of frontier of American authoritarianism, which was manifesting itself in, very frightening forms of bigotry. We can recall the Muslim ban, for instance, is xenophobia against Mexicans at the southern border with the proposal of the Mexico Wall. But we fast forward 8 to 10 years later now, and a lot of this authoritarianism and anti-constitutionalism, like you've identified, is coming from the left. I myself work on a college campus, and let me tell you, the first couple of weeks of this genocide, the majority of my time was basically dedicated to defending students who were losing their internships, who were losing their jobs, some of them facing suspension on college campuses across the United States because they were vocal on what was happening in Gaza. And that just demonstrates that this conflation of anti-Semitism with any bona fide good faith critique of the state of Israel is very much being spearheaded by, I caution to call it the progressive left, but I call it the neoliberal left, which is tied to empire in ways that are just as staunch as the old guard conservatives, and specifically the neoconservatives who ushered in the war on terror, were so deeply connected to American empire, the war on terror, and the structural Islamophobia, and the denial of the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. But you're exactly right. Now it's coming from the left, which makes it very troubling for somebody like me, because I've been very progressive on issues, especially those tied to anti-racism, free speech, freedom of assembly. But these rights have been entirely eroded by this new leftist front, which is anything but democratic.
Indeed. Let's turn to the region, if we may, Professor. The push is on to create a civil war in Lebanon, exactly as was done in other parts of the world. A classic color revolution is being fomented in Lebanon. The American ambassador, just like Victoria Nuland in Ukraine back in the day, 2014, is openly acting as a concert party organizer. She is seeking to rally the sovereigntists, by which she means the fascist, literally phalangist. Literally, they call themselves phalangists. Samir Jaja and other far-right forces in Lebanon, and to their shame, one or two other forces who should and do know better. She's openly trying to bring about a civil war in Lebanon to weaken the resistance. But the resistance goes on and on and on, despite the attempted decapitation, actually quite successful decapitation of the Lebanese resistance. The fighters are, if anything, fighting even more successfully than they did last time. And so much so, Israel is openly talking about withdrawing from the ground invasion of Lebanon. How do you see all that?
No, I mean that's an excellent analysis, and let me respond in two ways. The first sort of segment of your prompt, identifies something that the Netanyahu war machine tied to the American government have been trying to do very emphatically over these last several weeks, which is to bring about a fracturing and basically infighting in the United States, redeploying, old bad feelings in the country. And the Phalange, like you've identified, and Jaja, their hands are deeply rooted in blood. I mean, they were the ones who spearheaded, you recall, the Sabra and Shatila massacres in 1982. And even beyond that, these are deeply Islamophobic elements. So they capitalize and they believe in the same sort of conflations of terrorism with Muslim identity that the Israeli government and the American government does. And this is old classic divide and conquer strategy that any imperial or neo-imperial governments like to engage in. But fortunately, a lot of that is failing, because even though you've cut off the head of the resistance, much of the might of the resistance is not located at the head. It's located at the marrow, it's located at the heart, and it's located at the grassroots levels within Lebanon. And that's obviously being manifested very vividly in the ways in which fighters in South Lebanon have been able to repel, have been able to push, and in many ways, entirely dismantle the American and Israeli objective of reoccupying South Lebanon. This doesn't come to a surprise to me, because for those of us, and you mentioned that I looked young, I'm actually not that young. If you recall 2006 very specifically, this was in many respects a replay of 2006. One thing we know about the Israeli army is they're not very adept on the ground. They're only effective when bombing from up high, airstrikes, carpet bombing. When it comes to traditional old school, mano a mano type fighting, they're not going to win. And they're actually playing into the hands of the resistance in Lebanon. And even though you cut off the head, again, the metaphor goes that those on the ground are very much who are fighting, advancing the resistance, and where the real heart of the resistance is.
It is a remarkable, in that sense, it's a race against time. If the current level, according to Lieberman, the Israeli opposition member of parliament, leader of the opposition, he said that Israel has lost, and that was 2 days ago, 810 dead and 11,800 wounded. Now, this was in Gaza and Lebanon, but the vast majority of those numbers will relate to Lebanon. Israel cannot afford that level of loss. First of all, they pay a very high price in their society and in their electorate for dead soldiers. I mean, they simply can't afford it from a political point of view, but they can't afford it even numerically, because Gallant was saying that they have lost a division and they have to make it up. But they're already mobilizing the most obvious reserves that they have at their disposal. And unlike the Palestinians, they don't have friends all around the world that are going to send them soldiers, unless the Americans send them soldiers. But I don't think even Joe Biden is that stupid. So it's a race against time. If Israel has to withdraw from South Lebanon, this will make the resistance standing in Lebanon very high indeed, and probably thwart the efforts at creating civil war in Lebanon. If the war were to continue, if the air war against Beirut were to spread into Christian areas, there are many Christian areas in Baalbek, for example, being bombed this evening, and in Marjayoun, I saw there were bombing raids. So it is possible that we can avoid the worst in Lebanon by the Israelis having to pull out and having to scale back. What's your view on that?
No, your analysis is exactly, on point. In my estimation, when I was assessing what could happen in Lebanon roughly a month or a month and a half ago, the ground invasion was the biggest domino, in my opinion. If Israel was able to win on the ground and occupy a significant portion of South Lebanon, then that would open the door toward a range of things. Basically, what my assessment of this entire sort of scenario of pushing Greater Israel or Eretz Israel, which is driving the state of Israel right now, was looking to reshape the contours of the modern Arab world, right? It doesn't necessarily mean annexation of the country of Lebanon, but what it might mean is implementation of a client government that's going to do its bidding in line with the Abraham Accords, sort of what you have in the UAE what you have in Bahrain, what you have in Morocco, a government in Lebanon that is anti-resistance, maybe led by the Maronites, some sort of like coalition between the Maronites and Sunni Muslim factions and the Druze, who would essentially capitulate to Israel's interests. Now, that would have been possible only if Israel would have won on the ground in Lebanon and was able to successfully occupy South Lebanon, and then obviously deflate Hezbollah's influence across the country. But since that's happening, and you're exactly right, the esteem for the Hezb in Lebanon is going to increase considerably if they lose the ground war in South Lebanon, and they will lose. They're already losing. And like you've stated, the number of casualties and the number of people dead is not only higher than you've quoted. Galan said the other day that it is one of the sort of guidelines of the military not to disclose the actual number of individuals killed and injured in the ground invasion, because like you said, this is not something they can politically and even economically afford. You have to also consider context. When you're talking about a sort of first world, comfortable sort of society like Israeli society is, they don't have the psychological makeup to sort of endure the kind of casualties a country like Lebanon or the people of Gaza can endure. I always go back to the Battle of Algiers, right? The Battle of Algiers, that really transformative film, highlights the idea that the one way in which you can defeat a imperial power is to disrupt their psychology so incessantly that they think twice about engaging in the kind of imperial sort of sieges that the United States and Israel have, sort of partook in over the last year. But if the ground invasion fails, then this is a huge, huge, huge knock in the imperial sort of objectives of the Netanyahu war machine to push greater Israel, not only into Lebanon, but then the next step would have been Syria, and the next step would have been perhaps, part of Egypt, Jordan, and so on.
Finally, Professor, I'm right, am I, that Iran has the legal right to retaliate to the third Israeli attack upon herself. And Israel has announced already that there will be a fourth. Do you expect them to do so? And do you expect it before the US election?
It's hard to predict. And when you talk about legality and legal rights, one thing that I talk about in my work is that, international law, especially international law that's enshrined by Western institutions, is always selectively applied. Now, in terms of theoretically speaking, of course, any sovereign state that is being attacked has the right to respond in kind, right? Whether Iran responds before the election, I don't know. I think that if they did, that would seem to play in the hands of the Trump campaign, because obviously, this sort of like moment of instability, war and warmongering that the Biden-Harris administration have not only ushered in, but fully enabled and financed. An Iranian response before the election, I think, would sort of like align with Trump's rhetoric that this regime has brought forth a stage of genocidal war that we haven't even seen in modern history.
I can't resist, because you're such an eminent law professor. I want to test you on this. I have always believed that international law was a figment. It was lipstick on the pig of raw imperial power. I never believed that they truly believed in international law. I opposed, for example, in Parliament, the creation of the ICC. And I predicted correctly so far that nobody will ever be on trial in front of your ICC except black Africans and Serbians. And so far, my prediction 20 years ago is still correct. I look at the ICJ and all the enormous effort that has been made by South Africa and by all these other countries and all these eminent jurists. I watched live all these eminent judges give their verdict, and absolutely nothing has happened. Absolutely nothing has changed. So I know it's your profession, but why should we believe in this fairy story about international law?
Yeah, even though I'm part of the profession, I think one thing that I try to do as a scholar is to identify these contradictions and the hypocrisy that are laden deeply in Western law. And you're exactly right. International law and international legal institutions specifically have essentially shown themselves to be not only ineffectual, but in many respects complicit in the advancement of genocide, or in the fact that they neglect many legitimate genocides that are still taking place. Now, I will say this: I think that this moment is, kind of like more complicated, perhaps, because there has been, in many respects, an unprecedented surge in the global, the international human rights community, if you will, with countries across Western Europe like Spain, countries across the quote unquote global South, who have attempted to use institutions like the United Nations and the ICJ to not only identify that a genocide is taking place, but to push forward practical action. Now, the reason why international legal institutions sadly have been ineffectual is because the way in which they're structured and designed enables a country like the United States, which is entirely wed to this genocide, to essentially undermine global will, even when unanimous. You saw what happened at the General Assembly. You saw that there were 4 votes at the UN Security Council, where there was real considerable will on the part of the 15 members of the Security Council to bring forward a ceasefire. But it was only one country, the United States, which was able to undermine all of that global will. Now, one thing that I would push for is a restructuring of the Security Council of the United Nations, where one country doesn't have that kind of hegemonic ability to entirely dismiss and undermine the ability to put a stop to genocide. That's something that we have to take seriously, post Gaza, and hopefully that's something that can be done if the United Nations wants to be taken seriously moving forward as a transnational institution of real repute.
Of course, that could only be done if the country you're talking about didn't veto the attempt to do it. But I could talk to you all night, Professor. I'm really glad you came on the show. I hope we get the chance to talk again. Professor Khaled Beydoun, a real scholar. Say hi to Dearborn for me, please. I love it dearly.